This morning we continue looking at the book of Genesis, but I'll be honest with you, I wanted to skip this part. I wanted to get into the fun stuff, talk about dinosaurs and Cro-Magnon man, all that kind of fun stuff that comes up in the book of Genesis. But you know what? I felt convicted. Not only to not skip this part, but to take 2 weeks on it. You guys all need to pray for your pastor. He's failing. He's failing at honoring the Sabbath day and keeping it holy. Let's talk about that. The book of Genesis, and if you have a Bible, turn to Matthew chapter 12. We'll get there. I don't have a lot of verses on the screen today, but I do want to have this one up for you. Genesis chapter 2. God has just created all that there is. The heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. And if you remember at the end of chapter 1, he steps back almost like an artist with this deep, deep, abiding satisfaction in what he had just done. And he says, it is very good. By the seventh day, God had finished the work that he had been doing. And so on the seventh day, he rested. Now, mind you, God does not get tired. That's why we need to understand what's really going on here. He rested from all of his work. And then God blessed. This is the third time that he will bless part of his creation. He blessed the animals and all the animal kingdom, fish and birds. And he said, be fruitful and multiply. He blessed at mankind and said, be fruitful and multiply. But now he blesses a day of the week. Interesting. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. That's a church word that's thrown around a lot, the idea of holiness, but really it means to be set apart from. That's the literal meaning, to be set apart. The seventh day would be set apart from all other days because on it he rested from all the work of that he had done. We talk about creation, especially where we live. I mean, we're a little spoiled, let's be honest, what we get to see and what we get to experience when we walk out our front doors. People pay a lot of money not only to live here, but to visit here. And we get to live here. But maybe what I've missed, I don't know about you, but what I've missed is what God did on the seventh day. I love what he did on the first 6 days. But I struggle with what he did on the seventh day. I don't struggle with him, but I struggle with what does that mean for me? What are the implications? What does it mean to honor the Sabbath day? Is that just an Old Testament, archaic belief system that really doesn't apply to us today as Christians, certainly Christians in America in the modern world, that is fast and that is loud and that is tired? Well, fast forward in Scripture a little bit, and you don't have to turn there, let me read it to you, but by the time Moses comes along, and you remember the people of Israel were enslaved, they were in Egypt, and then when God pulls them out of Egypt and gives them the promised land, actually before they even get to the promised land, God gives his people the 10 suggestions. Commandments. Because they're not suggestions. But they are intended, and this is so important to understand God's commands, they are never given to restrict us or to handcuff us or to steal our joy and fulfillment in life. They are actually given to us to preserve those things. God understands how we were wired. He understands how individually, how families flourish, how societies flourish. And it's when we live within those bounds, within those boundaries of at least, at a bare minimum, the 10 Commandments. And so you fast forward, and even before God gives the 10 Commandments, you remember when they were on their journey to the promised land? How did God feed the people of Israel. Do you remember that? Manna, which literally means, what is it? That's what they named it. What is it? Well, we'll call it that. But God would provide for his people manna from heaven. And you remember, he told them, for 6 days you are to collect only what you need to eat, no more. In a culture that has more. He says, don't collect any more than what you need, but on the 6th day, collect double. Why? Because on the 7th day, you're not to collect anything. Don't go out there. And if you keep something from one of the other days and think, we'll save it for a rainy day, guess what? You go to get it, it'll be rotten. Even if you wait just one day. And of course, those type A personalities, those hardworking people, what do they do on the 7th day? They go out there to look for manna. And right after that, God gives them the 10 Commandments. And number 4 says this, Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. And I want you to pay attention because I'm going to read the 10 Commandments in Exodus, and then I'm going to read them in Deuteronomy. And they're a little different, and that's on purpose. In Exodus chapter 20, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, by setting it apart, by honoring it, by respecting it. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath, a rest to the Lord your God. Notice the Sabbath is to the Lord. And on it, you shall not do any work, neither you, and this is revolutionary. This makes perfect sense to us, but this is absolutely revolutionary considering the culture that they just came out of in Egypt, considering the culture that they're going to, the Mesopotamian area, the Babylonian, the Philistines, all of those surrounding nations. On it, you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. Remember, they were slaves. Did slaves get a Sabbath rest? For in 6 days, but I want you to notice the reason. Moses goes all the way back to the book of Genesis chapter 2. For in 6 days, this is why you need to honor or remember the Sabbath day. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore God blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. And so the motivation is to honor creation, to honor how God made us and made the world that we live in. There are rhythms all around us. There are seasons, there are times, and even nature itself thrives when it lives in that rhythm. And one of the rhythms God has asked us to live in is that rhythm of work and rest. Work and rest. But you fast forward about 40 years, and what happened is, and this is why we see again in the Torah a second law, Deuteronomy, second law, because now you have an entire generation that did not grow up in slavery. All of those people are gone. That was their parents and their grandparents. And so Moses, right at the beginning of Deuteronomy in chapter 5, he starts off by reminding and reiterating to a whole new generation God's way of flourishing and thriving in this world. But notice the difference. Observe the Sabbath day. He doesn't tell them to remember this time. He tells them to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. And on it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your female or male servant, nor your ox, your donkey, or your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns, so that, purpose clause, your male and female servants may rest as you do. So a lot of similarity in there, but then now it changes again. First of all, observe instead of remember, and now he's going to motivate us not by creation, but by another reason. remember that you were slaves. Why do we need to honor the Sabbath day? Remember that you were slaves in Egypt and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Now you fast forward again in the Old Testament scriptures. And you have the nation of Israel. It grows. It takes over the whole promised land. And then after 1,000 years, I don't remember, about 1,000 years later, actually not that long even, only about 700 or 800 years, Israel is punished, disciplined by God. And they are taken captive and brought into exile by the nation of Babylon. And one of the reasons that they were taken was because they were being disobedient, they were stubborn, they were worshiping other gods, they were breaking all the 10 commandments. But what's interesting and fascinating to me is that you will be away, through the prophet Jeremiah, he tells the people of Israel, you will be in exile, in captivity for 70 years. And the reason it's 70 years and not 65 years or 100 years, 70 years to account for every year you dishonored the Sabbath of the land. Isn't that interesting? God gave the Sabbath to the animals, to servants. I mean, this was revolutionary. This was countercultural in the world that they were living in at that time. To take a day and stop. That's what Sabbath literally means. Stop. Refrain. Don't. And even the land. So every 6 years they are to work the land, they can harvest and they can grow food. But then God told them in the book of Leviticus, do not harvest, do not work the land on that 7th year. The land needs rest. And I find that fascinating. And the motivation he gives them in Deuteronomy is, again, because you were slaves. And so for 70 years, they are, fast forward those 70 years, they've served their time, those 70 years, and then through the prophet or the administrator, the prime minister, I don't know what his official title was, but his name was Nehemiah. And Nehemiah is called by God, along with Ezra, along with Zerubbabel, and these other people during that time. They are called and even gifted. This is just fascinating how God works. All the gold and all the wealth and all the riches that had been stolen by Babylon and then taken over by the Persian Empire was given back to the people of Israel through Nehemiah. And Nehemiah was tasked with going back to Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple. Now, you got to hold on to that idea, because remember, in the Old Testament, the way of thinking and everything was about the temple. All of life surrounded the temple. Why? Because the temple represented what? The presence of God. The very presence of God. And that's why it was so devastating for the people of Israel when the temple was destroyed. It's as if God had abandoned and left them. But now God is still working with them, still bringing them back to Jerusalem. He still has a plan. He still is going to bring the Messiah through the people of Israel. And so they rebuild the temple. And again, hold on to that idea. That idea of the temple is super, super important. It is a big deal. But then you fast forward. Again, the Persian Empire defeated the Babylonian Empire. And then you had the Greek Empire, and they defeated the Persian Empire. And then you had the Roman Empire, and they defeated the Greek Empire. But all along, Israel as a state, as a nation, does not exist, but they are allowed to worship God at the temple. This is what is called the whole Second Temple era. It's a lot of it happens in between Malachi and the book of Matthew. It's that 400 years where the Jewish nation just continued and people continued to think and write and what does it mean to be a follower of God? And one of the things that they started to do was they were really motivated, especially early on. They did not want to lose their temple again. They did not want to disappoint God. They did not want to disobey God. And so they were working really hard and trying really hard. How do we follow the law? How do we do it right? And when it came to the Sabbath, When they came to the Sabbath, they got into the nitty-gritty. They started to write. We might call it a commentary. They call it the Mishnah. And it was basically an explanation. Here's how you obey the fourth commandment. And a whole bunch of other stuff was included in that as well. And they came up with dozens and dozens and dozens. I think it's over 600 separate rules on how to obey the Sabbath. How far could you walk on the Sabbath? How far could you carry your coat on the Sabbath? How long could you brush your teeth? Should you brush your teeth on the Sabbath? One of the interesting things was if a building fell down on the Sabbath, you could break the Sabbath in order to move rubble if someone's alive. But if someone's dead, no work. You got to wait until the Sabbath rest is over, and then you can dig them out and bury them. So they had gotten into such the detail of what it means to honor the Sabbath. And then you fast forward those 400 years, and Jesus comes on the scene, and guess what? They have completely missed the boat. And yet the Sabbath, if you read the Gospels, over and over and over, Jesus is having conflict with the religious people. By the way, if you get annoyed by religious people, you're in good company. We get annoyed by religious people here. But Jesus was always confronting the religious people, challenging the religious people, questioning their way and their system, and this is what he does with the Sabbath. So you fast forward to the time of Jesus. Jesus is roughly 30, 31 years old, and he comes along, and this is where we're going to finally get into the book of Matthew, chapter 12. This is what he says. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pick some of the grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, now, by the way, that was perfectly legal to do. If you have farm, and this is one of the other Old Testament laws, I've talked about this before, but they had this rule that you could not maximize your profits if you were a landowner. You could not harvest all of your crop. You had to leave the edges for poor people, for foreigners, so that they could go and take care of themselves. And so they're doing this. They're walking through, they're grabbing grain, they're squishing it, and they're eating the seeds. And the Pharisees, who are probably trying to catch him at doing something wrong, look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. Now, are they breaking the Sabbath? Well, you know what? It's illegal on the Sabbath to harvest. So in a technical sense, yeah, they're plucking, they're harvesting, they're eating, they're breaking the rule. But Jesus answered, haven't you read? Do you know how insulting that is to a Pharisee, to a religious person? Haven't you read? Oh, I love, Jesus is so wise and so good. Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered into the house of God, and he and his companions, by the way, they're being chased by an enemy that wants to kill them, and they hide out in a temple, in the tabernacle, in the house of God, and his companions ate the consecrated bread. That was the show bread. That was the bread that was there more for show than to eat, and they weren't supposed to eat it. But David ate it. His companions ate it, and it was okay. They didn't break the Sabbath. Or haven't you read in the law that the priest on the Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? In other words, the priests have to work on the Sabbath, and they're working in the temple on the Sabbath. They're breaking the Sabbath technically, but they're innocent. Now, this is one of the interesting things about, of all the 10 commandments, the Sabbath, the fourth commandment, is the only one where there's a shift. You don't, in a pinch, in an emergency, commit adultery. In a pinch, under pressure, you don't go, do something else, murder someone. But when it comes to the Sabbath, it seems that there are exceptions. And this is what he says. Haven't you read in the law that the priests on the Sabbath in the temple desecrate the Sabbath, yet are innocent. I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. Wow. Those are subversive words. Them's fighting words. If you had known what these words mean, haven't you read? Don't you know what it means? Do you see how insulting Jesus is being? I desire mercy, not sacrifice. If you knew what those words mean, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. He's not done yet. The very next verse, Matthew chapter 12, verse 9, going on from that place, he went into their synagogue. And a man with a shriveled hand was there, looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus. They asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Why? Because healings work. And he said to them, if any of you, he always answers with a question, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into the pit on the Sabbath, will you take hold of it and lift it out? Will you save a sheep? And sheep are dumb. They're pretty useless. But you'll save a sheep. Are not people much more valuable? Therefore, it is lawful, you're not breaking the Sabbath, to do good on the Sabbath. And then he said to the man, and this is where he just brings it home, stretch out your hand. And so he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other hand. But the Pharisees, are they celebrating this? Are they happy for this man? They went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. Isn't that interesting? Like I said, if you've ever thought you don't like religious people, neither does Jesus. If you've ever known someone who has a problem with religion in general, so did Jesus. And my encouragement to you or to those that you know would be, your beef is probably not with Jesus. It's with what people have done in the name of Jesus. And so don't hide. If you have friends like this, tell them, don't hide behind a hypocrite. Discover for yourself. Read the Gospels. Study the life of Jesus for yourself. But what Jesus is saying here, and this is important, he's not dismissing the Sabbath. He's not saying it's unimportant. He's actually elevating the true and original meaning of the Sabbath. He's highlighting it here. And that if we as followers of Christ, even in the New Testament era, if we don't understand what it means to follow the Sabbath today, we may be in trouble. So I want to talk about three things. I'm only going to get through two today. I got into this and I said, there's no way I want to just squeeze this in. So we're going to finish it next week. But I want to start and answer two questions. The first question is, why do we need a Sabbath? Why do we need a Sabbath? You know, if you talk about our bodies physically, it's obvious. You cannot function at a high level, talk to any athlete, if you don't rest. But because we live in maybe the fastest, most stressed out culture in history, we are a tired people. We are distracted people. We are a burdened people. We are restless people. That is, we are a people without rest. We wear busyness like a badge of honor. We will quickly admit that we're stressed, and we almost wear that as a badge of honor. And there's some reality to that. There's some truth to that. I mean, we are a tired people. We are a busy people. We are a stressed people. Americans are according to many people, the most overworked people in the industrialized world, especially when it comes to the amount of hours we put in a work week, the amount of vacation that we get, and the amount of holidays that we have time off to celebrate. Study the book of the Old Testament in the nation of Israel and how often they were told to rest and to celebrate. But there's some reasons that we're such an overworked people. And even when we take vacations, we may take time off work, but we're not rested in the true sense of what Jesus is inviting us to. I was listening to one podcast and they were talking about a little bit indirectly about this, and I was struck by what they were talking about in terms of social media. There's actually terms that are being coined that did not exist before. For example, Instagram brain. Have you heard of that? Instagram brain? They say you know you have Instagram brain because you become, over time, obsessed and overly materialistic. Or how about Twitter brain? You know someone has Twitter brain because it makes you, over time, angry and argumentative. Or how about news media brain? News media brain will make you fearful and angry. And so, let's go back to the scene. The disciples are walking along and they see some fields and they begin to pick grain. They rub it in their hands to eat, which is harvesting in a technical sense, forbidden work according to the Mishnah, according to the interpretation of what it means to honor the Sabbath. But I want you to notice again that Jesus is not condemning the Sabbath. He's condemning the religious interpretation and misapplication of the Sabbath. Jesus is actually all about the Sabbath. And in his words, he challenges the Old Testament way of thinking. Something greater than the temple is here. How can you not worship? How can you not honor that? See, what Jesus was teaching here is that the Sabbath is not just about ceasing from work. It's not just about having a day off. It's not about, working 40 hours a week and taking the weekend off, whatever your schedule might be. He wants us not to adjust our schedule so much. He does want to, maybe some of us, to adjust our schedule. But the most important thing that he's trying to get at is an adjustment of our soul. An adjustment of our soul. And in all honesty, here's where I'm at. And it's going to come out on you now. This is what God is teaching me. This is a life or death thing. Honoring the Sabbath and understanding what Scripture is really teaching us about honoring the Sabbath. It's not natural. It's counterintuitive. It's not easy. In fact, it takes a lot of work, ironically, to enter into this rest, soul rest. But as I said, our current cultural moment has presented some really difficult challenges, and I think it's fair to say that we live in a world today where this is more difficult than it's probably ever been in world history. Some of you can remember a day when stores were not open on Sunday. Made it easy to honor the Sabbath when culture was all about it. In fact, I think they call them blue laws. There's actually some blue laws that still exist to this day where in certain counties and certain states you cannot purchase alcohol on Sunday. So you better plan ahead. But there's other reasons too. Not only has our culture changed where it is 24/7, everything we can get, even if we don't go to a store, we can sit on Amazon and we can go, I want that, I'm going to order that, it'll be here tomorrow. But we also live in a world where many people have multiple jobs, especially living in this area. It's hard to have just one job and to be able to afford to live here. Here's what's interesting. Back in 1960, I wasn't even a thought yet. Back in 1960, 20% of mothers worked. You know what it is today? 70%. And so that has an impact on culture. 70% of families that have kids are growing up in a two-income family with both parents working There's a lot of implications to that. And this is not just about the mom staying home. I know a lot of families, I know a few families, I shouldn't say a lot, but I know a few families where the dad is the stay-at-home dad because just their situation and her job is enough. But there's another reason. Not only do we live in an overworked culture, technology has greatly changed this. As I talked about, Instagram, news, it's all with us all the time. We don't have to wait till the 9 o'clock news comes on to find out what's going on. It's right here. And so, because we can work anywhere nowadays, especially after the pandemic, a lot of people are trying to figure out, how can I keep this job and keep working from home? But because we can work from anywhere, it tends to mean that we work all the time. We're always kind of on. And here's a third factor. Some of you old folks, oldsters, I don't like the word old folks. Some of you remember a time when you got out of high school, maybe you went to college, you got a job, and 40, 50 years later, you retired. That ain't the world we live in today. In fact, it's very frustrating for companies, especially with millennials. They can't figure out how to keep them. And you know what's changed? Here's what's changed. People never asked the question in previous generations, will I be happy at my job? Job satisfaction had nothing to do with work. It was, I need to provide for my family, I need to be responsible, I'm going to work. You didn't think about leaving that job. Nowadays, people will change jobs every year or two. Because people are motivated nowadays, especially young people, I want to be happy in what I do. And that is a dangerous path to go down. Now, I'm all for finding a job, if you can, that is fulfilling. Nothing wrong with that. But what's happened is that we get into our careers, we work, and we thought we'd be satisfied, but we're not. And that scares us. Because no longer is work and family the primary thing. What has become the primary thing is, I want to be satisfied, I want to be happy at work. And if we're not, it's scary. And there's a discontent, and there's a fear, and there's an anxiety. And so if you take, the fact that many people have multiple jobs, you take the fact that technology have changed things, those in itself make it hard to rest. Hard to take a day off for some people. Hard not to put in 90 hours sometimes. By the way, they figured out that a person that works 90 hours a week compared to someone who works 50 to 55 hours a week, no difference in production. And what's interesting, if you work 50 to 55 hours, that's about 6 days' work. But that third one I mentioned, job satisfaction, that has made us more restless. Because we feel like we're missing something. We feel like we're missing out. We feel like we need to find that emotional, social, psychological fulfillment with work. That work needs to give us that, and it can't. But what's interesting is, despite how things are today in our current culture, the Sabbath law has been around for a long time. It's been around for thousands of years, since the beginning of creation. And you think, why? Because there's a human condition. There's a brokenness in us as humans that has existed from the time that Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden. And it's an issue that only the Sabbath can address. Okay? That sounds like hyperbole. It's not. This is life and death, church. Figuring out how to honor the Sabbath, to find that deep, abiding rest in our souls. Only the Sabbath can give us that. And so that human condition that I'm describing, what is it? It's not just that we're broken. It's not just that we're sinful. Let me summarize it this way. There is a work beneath the work. Some of you are fortunate to have been retired. You don't In fact, you know what? I've known a lot of retired people that are more tired after retirement. And there's a reason for that. And it's what I'm talking about right now. There is a work beneath the work. There's a work beneath our jobs, our careers, our income. Let me explain it this way. Sleep experts understand how important it is for us to reach a deep level of sleep. They call it what? REM, REM, rapid eye movement sleep. In fact, we know that you can take 8 one-hour naps throughout the day, and you know what? You'll be a wreck. Because you'll never get to that, and it takes time, you'll never get to that deep level of sleep where REM takes place, where your brain actually begins to repair itself, where your body is repairing itself, and it's that deep REM sleep that gives us that. And according to some experts, we need more than just a day that we don't work. A vacation in Hawaii is not going to give you this. We need that deep REM level of rest, which I would define this way. Here's what the work beneath the work is. I need to prove myself. I need to justify myself. Men struggle with this more, by the way, ladies, in our careers. Because we're looking for our careers to give us something that it can't give us. And so we need to prove ourselves to others. We need to prove ourselves to ourselves. And some of us live with an unrest, a restless soul, because we feel like we need to prove ourselves to God. And this is what makes us tired. This is what makes us weary. This is what makes us burdened. I'll never forget, as someone who got out of this culture for a little over 2 years, some of you have had the opportunity to do that. When we went as missionaries to Swaziland, after 18 months out of this culture, I rested. I was just as busy the last 9 months as I was the first 18 months. But something had changed in here. What I realized, and some of you will laugh at this, but I had a chip on my shoulder. His name was Chip Ingram. And I also had a Glenn on my other shoulder, Glenn Miller. These are two of my most impactful mentors I've ever had. And there was a part of me being thousands of miles away in another country where they would be proud of me. I hope they would be proud of me. I hope they would be pleased with what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. There was this work beneath this work, this need to justify myself. To good, godly men, yes, good, godly men. But until I got those chips off my shoulder, I rested. And then I moved back here. See, again, the Sabbath is an invitation to a deep REM soul rest, where maybe less is more. It's a rest that another vacation can't fix, buying more of whatever cannot fix. It's a rest that binging on Netflix cannot fix. It's a rest that even scrolling on Amazon cannot buy more. You know what comes to mind as I'm thinking about this? This idea of the work beneath the work, the needing to prove ourselves, was the best movie ever made, Rocky I. And I don't know if you remember that, but do you remember there was a scene before the fight? And he was nervous and he was anxious, and I think he was talking to either his girlfriend or his trainer, but he says these words. He says these words. If I don't go to the distance, I need to go to the distance. I don't care if I win or lose, but I have to go to the distance so that I can prove to myself I'm not a bum. Which reminds me of another great movie, Movie of the year back in 1984, Chariots of Fire. And you have that sprinter, Harold Abrams, famous sprinter back then, who right before his 100-yard race, because it was 100 yards back then, he said these words, "I have only 10 lonely seconds to justify my existence." Only 10 lonely seconds to justify my existence. And you know what? He got that gold medal. But it didn't fill the void that he thought it would. And then you have a guy like Eric Liddell, which is really who the movie is all about. He was supposed to be in that race. He was probably the favored. He was probably the one that was going to win it, but they scheduled it on Sunday. And he was a Sabbatarian. And without any pressure internally, but a ton of pressure externally going high up to government officials, pressuring him to race on Sunday, put country before your God, he says no. And then he entered a race that he never ran, and he won it. And he got the gold, but it didn't matter, because you know what he said was, when I run, I feel the pleasure of God. You see what I'm saying? Do you know? Are you living in that deep REM soul rest? And I confess to you, I'm not. When you're not living in that rest, it's really not about how much time you're putting at work. It's not how much time you take off on vacation. You know what you start to think? You start to think, I kind of want to get sick. Because then I can just lay in bed and do nothing. It's not a healthy place to be. So where do we get it? Where do we get this rest? Next week I'm going to tell you how we get it, so come back. This week I want to tell you, where do we get it? I want you to notice how Jesus responds. He reminds them of an incident, as we said, in 1 Samuel chapter 21, where David is on the run, people trying to kill him. He goes into the tabernacle, he takes the showbread, and he eats it. And Jesus, as he reminds them of that, he says, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. And here's what he's saying. I want you to notice. And I kind of already alluded to this. No other moral law can be just put aside. There's something about the Sabbath, the way they understood it, that would make it obsolete. There was something that would happen. There was someone who would come and make the way they viewed the Sabbath obsolete. And so look what Jesus says. I am the Lord of the Sabbath. And you think about that. Think about the implications. What if you marinated, I love that word, just thought deeply about that title he gives himself. I am the Lord of the Sabbath. If you want that deep soul rest, what Jesus is saying, you don't go to the temple, you come to him. You must come to him, not to rules, not to regulations, not to laws, not to religion. You need to come to him. And if you've come to Jesus, and this is where it gets difficult for you and I, if you've come to Jesus and you don't have that rest, you don't know what you have. You don't know what you have. And again, creation helps us here. It's good that he gave us this after the 6 days of creation. But you remember last week I talked about how every day of creation, after every day of creation, what did God say over and over and over? He saw that it was good. He saw that it was good. He stepped back. He's given us an idea of the seventh day and what it means to rest. God, after working for 6 days, steps back with a deep satisfaction at what he did. And so the definition of rest has something to do with being satisfied. Being at rest, being satisfied. And again, he's not talking about the absence of work. Adam and Eve had to work. They were given the responsibility and the command to work and to rule over all of creation. And so I think what the author is saying here, let me go back. I forgot to mention a verse in Hebrews chapter 4. Hebrews, written to Christians in the first century. And we don't know who the author was, but this is what he says. Consequently, a Sabbath rest remains for the people of God. A Sabbath rest remains for the people of God. And he says this in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 10. For the one who enters God's rest has also rested from his works. The work beneath the work. Just as God did from his own works. And here's what I think the writer of Hebrews is saying. He's not talking about the absence of work, as I said. I think what the author is saying here, and what is essential to understanding what it means to be a Christian, I think he's talking about earning. So you can work and you can earn. And you can work and not earn. And you can live in such a way as to try to earn and not even work. He's talking about trying to prove ourselves. He's talking about entering a rest that God is inviting us to. And here's the thing, you need to know it's an invitation. That's the mystery and the beauty of the Sabbath. It is both a command that we must obey, but it is also an invitation that God has given us. Isaiah chapter 57, verse 20 says this. The wicked are like the tossing sea, which cannot rest. A person who is wicked and going against God can never really experience that deep, abiding soul rest. But for us as Christians, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21 says, God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Who does God give this rest to? People who are made righteous. And this is so critical because we are told today, one of the big things we are told today by culture is you just need to learn to love yourself and then you'll be okay. The problem is, and I've said this before, we can't give ourselves what we don't have. It needs to come from a source outside of ourselves. We need a source outside of ourselves that says, you're okay. You're okay. And because of what Christ did on the cross, and you cannot eliminate that. Christ didn't die as an example for us to follow. He died because we were without hope if he didn't. He took on the sin. He became sin. He did a transaction with us. He did a substitute with us. He said, I will give you all of my righteousness, and I will take all of your sin. And when that goes from here to here, for some of you it's still up here. You've heard it maybe 1,000 times. But when it moves here, it is beautiful. It is life-changing. It is a freedom that maybe you've never known. You know, here's the thing. In Deuteronomy, Moses said, remember that you were slaves. I wonder how many of us are slaves this morning. A slaves to those oughts and those shoulds. A slaves to the expectations we put on ourselves. A slave to the expectations other people put on us. A slave to our culture. A slave to perhaps all kinds of other things. And we're really not free if we're not living in that rest. But his death did exactly what it needed to, so that we could enter into that rest. What did Jesus say when he hung on the cross? The very last words before he took his last breath. What did he say? It's finished. It's finished. All of creation, 6 days, it is finished. It is good. And because we now bear the righteousness of God, when God sees us, he doesn't see us as we are. He sees us as we will one day be. And so when he steps back and he looks at you, you don't see this very often, but he sees it all the time. He looks at you and he says, it is very good. It is good. It is good. even when you're wrestling, even when you're struggling with sin, even when you fail, it's already been paid for. And the writer of Hebrews will go on and say a few verses later, he will say, make every effort to enter into that rest. Again, I want to say this is not hyperbole. This is a life or death situation. You must and I must learn to honor the Sabbath day, to observe it. Now, next week, I'm going to get into a lot of the nuts and bolts and how do you do that today? Does it have to be on a certain day or can it be on any day? I'll talk about that. But this morning, I want to finish up with a passage that Jesus gives us right before he had that interaction with the Pharisees about the Sabbath. Right before that, you flip back one page, you go to the very last 3 verses of Hebrews chapter 11, and this is what it says. And Jennifer so beautifully sang it over us. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. He's the only one that can. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Whatever picture, whatever image you have of Jesus, if this isn't a huge part of it, you're missing something. This is the Jesus I want you to see. This is the Jesus that he wants you to see. A Jesus that says, come. And you run. And so as you come to the table this morning, you're going to get a little cup of the juice with a little wafer there that represents his blood and his body. It reminds us, and we're called to remember this, and this is why we do it every week, because we are a people who so quickly forget. He did this for us. And what happened when he did this for us, when we put our faith, when we put our trust, when we accepted him into our life, that transaction took place. All of our sin was put on him, and all of his righteousness was given to us. Do you know that? Do you know that deeply in your soul? Father, this morning as we come to the table, we are reminded, because we are a people who often need to be reminded, that you are a good God. You are a good God who welcomes us as we are, who brings us into fellowship with you, who takes all of our sin, all of our flaws, all of our failures, takes it, you took it on yourself, and then you turned around and gave us all of your goodness, all of your righteousness. And so God, I have a feeling, maybe I'm the only one struggling in here today, but I have a feeling I'm not. And maybe there's many others here this morning that need to step in and experience that deep, abiding REM soul rest. And help us. God, even this week, let us think deeply and pray and listen to what it is that you want for us and how to go about doing that. But God, I'm convinced, and I've said it already, if I don't figure this out, I'm going to pay a price, a big price. Your people paid a price in exile for 70 years for dishonoring the Sabbath. And so help us. Empower us. Enlighten us. And we will follow. We will obey. In Jesus' name. And all God's people said, Amen. Amen.